The bulldozer's engine roared to life at 6 a.m., its steel blade gleaming in the morning sun as it carved through the ancient creek bed that had flowed behind Marcus Chen's house for over a century. But this wasn't just any construction project, this was HOA President Richard Blackwood's personal vendetta, disguised as neighborhood improvement. What Richard didn't know was that Marcus had been recording everything, and the evidence he'd gathered would soon turn the entire Willowbrook subdivision into a battlefield where secrets would be exposed, alliances would crumble, and the most powerful man in the neighborhood would discover that sometimes the quiet ones fight the dirtiest. The war Marcus Chen pressed his face against the kitchen window, watching in horror as the excavator's massive claw tore through the creek bed that had meandered behind his property for as long as anyone could remember. The gentle babbling of Willow Creek, the very waterway that had given their subdivision its name, was being silenced by the grinding of machinery and the shouted orders of construction workers. "What the hell are you doing?" Marcus burst through his back door, his coffee mug forgotten on the counter as he jogged across his yard toward the property line. The excavator operator, a weathered man in a hard hat, killed the engine and climbed down from his cab. "HOA approved project, sir. We are installing a drainage system and beautification feature." Beautification? Marcus gestured wildly at the muddy scar where the creek had been. "You're destroying a natural waterway." "Take it up with the HOA," the operator shrugged, reaching for a clipboard. "Richard Blackwood signed off on everything. Says it's been approved by the board." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Richard Blackwood, the man who'd made his life a living hell for the past 2 years with his petty citations and power trips. The man who'd fined him $200 for leaving his garbage cans out 15 minutes past the pickup time. The man who'd demanded he repaint his entire house because the shade of beige was not consistent with community standards. "I want to see the approval documents," Marcus demanded. "Don't have M with me. Like I said, take it up with the HOA." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Richard Blackwood emerged from the tree line, his silver hair perfectly styled. Despite the early hour, at 55, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who'd never been told no, his pressed khakis and polo shirt a stark contrast to Marcus's hastily thrown-on jeans and t-shirt. "Marcus," Richard said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I see you've discovered our little improvement project." "Little improvement?" Marcus's voice cracked with disbelief. "You're destroying the creek." "Oh, please. That muddy trickle was hardly scenic. We are creating a modern drainage solution that will prevent flooding and add property value. The new decorative stone channels will be much more attractive. You can't just eliminate a waterway without environmental permits." Richard's smile widened. "Actually, I can. The creek technically flows through HOA common property. The board voted unanimously to approve the project last month." "What board meeting? I never got a notice." "Perhaps you should check your mailbox more carefully." Richard pulled out his phone and made a show of taking a photo of Marcus. "Speaking of which, I'll be issuing you a citation for that garden gnome. Decorative statuary requires pre-approval." Marcus glanced back at the small ceramic gnome his daughter had given him for Father's Day. "Are you kidding me? Rules are rules, Marcus. Some of us understand that property values and community standards matter." Richard's tone was conversational, but his eyes were cold. "Now, I suggest you step back. You're interfering with authorized construction. This is insane. You're destroying something beautiful because you have some kind of personal vendetta against me." "Vendetta?" Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Marcus, you give yourself far too much credit. This is simply progress. Something you'd understand if you'd bothered to attend community meetings instead of skulking around your property like some kind of hermit." The excavator roared back to life, drowning out Marcus's response. He watched helplessly as another section of creek bed was scooped away, the clear water that had flowed there for generations now diverted into temporary pipes. "This isn't over," Marcus shouted over the noise. "Oh, but it is," Richard replied. "By tomorrow, your precious creek will be history. And frankly, the neighborhood will be better for it." As Richard walked away, Marcus pulled out his phone and started recording the destruction. His hands shook as he documented the excavator tearing through the creek bed, the muddy water backing up into stagnant pools, the ancient oak tree whose roots had been exposed by the digging. "The bastard didn't even give me a chance to fight it," Marcus muttered to himself, panning the camera across the devastation. But as he filmed, something caught his eye. The construction workers weren't just diverting the creek, they were routing it directly toward Richard's property. The new drainage system led to an elaborate stone fountain and pond system behind Richard's mansion, complete with decorative bridges and waterfall features. Marcus lowered his phone, his mind racing. This wasn't about neighborhood improvement or drainage. Richard had stolen the creek to create his own private water feature. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Richard hadn't just destroyed something Marcus loved, he'd literally stolen it for himself. "You son of a bitch," Marcus whispered, then raised his phone again, this time focusing on the pipes that led directly to Richard's backyard paradise. 20 minutes later, Marcus stood in his kitchen, scrolling through his phone contacts. He found the number he was looking for and hit dial. "Environmental Protection Agency, how can I help you?" "I need to report an illegal waterway diversion," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. As he spoke to the EPA representative, Marcus walked to his window and looked out at his neighbors' houses. Most of them were still asleep, unaware that their HOA president had just committed what might be a federal crime right under their noses. But Marcus was awake now. And he was done being pushed around. After hanging up with the EPA, he made another call. Then another. By the time the sun was fully up, Marcus had contacted the state environmental agency, the county water authority, and the local newspaper's environmental reporter. But his most important call was to his next-door neighbor, Sarah Martinez. "Sarah, I need your help," Marcus said when she answered. "Richard Blackwood just destroyed Willow Creek, and I think he's been lying to all of us about a lot more than just this project." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think it's time we found out what other secrets our HOA president has been hiding. Are you free for coffee this morning?" There was a pause, then Sarah's voice came back, tight with anger. "Marcus, I've been waiting 2 years for someone to finally stand up to that man. I'll be right over." As Marcus hung up, he looked back out at the construction site. Richard Blackwood had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed Marcus would roll over and take it, just like he had with every other humiliation over the past 2 years. But destroying the creek wasn't just another petty power play. It was a line in the sand, and Richard had crossed it. The war for Willowbrook was about to begin, and Marcus Chen was done being the victim. Outside, the excavator continued its work, but Marcus no longer felt helpless as he watched. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years when it came to dealing with Richard Blackwood. He felt hope. And Richard Blackwood, admiring his new water feature from his back patio, had no idea that his reign of terror was about to come to a very public, very humiliating end. Sarah Martinez arrived at Marcus's door 45 minutes later, her usually pristine appearance disheveled and her eyes blazing with fury. Behind her stood Tom Rodriguez, the retired police detective from 3 houses down, and Jennifer Walsh, the environmental lawyer who lived on Maple Street. "I called a few people," Sarah said without preamble. Tom saw the construction and knew something was wrong. Jennifer heard the machinery and came to investigate. Marcus led them to his kitchen table, where he'd spread out printed copies of every HOA document he could find online, along with screenshots from his phone showing the creek's destruction. "This is unbelievable," Jennifer said, studying the photos. "Do you have any documentation of the original creek bed?" 20 years worth, Marcus replied, pulling out a thick folder. "I've been documenting the wildlife, the water flow patterns, seasonal changes. I was working on a naturalist blog about suburban waterways." Tom leaned forward, his detective instincts kicking in. "Walk me through this morning again. Every detail." As Marcus recounted the morning's events, Tom took notes in a small notebook he'd produced from his pocket. When Marcus mentioned Richard's comment about the board vote, Tom's eyebrows shot up. "He said the board voted unanimously last month." "That's what he claimed." "That's interesting," Sarah interjected, "because I've been the HOA secretary for 3 years and there hasn't been a board meeting in 6 weeks. The last one was about the pool maintenance contract." The room fell silent. Are you saying there was no vote? Marcus asked. I'm saying I would have been there to take minutes if there had been a vote. And I would have sent out the meeting notices. Sarah's voice was tight with anger. He's been acting unilaterally. Jennifer was already pulling out her phone. I need to see the HOA bylaws and the original covenants. There are strict procedures for major common area modifications. I have those, Tom said unexpectedly. Everyone turned to him. When I moved in, I researched everything. Old habit. The HOA can't authorize major environmental changes without a 60-day notice period and a 2/3 majority vote of all residents, not just the board. So he's violated the HOA's own rules and probably state environmental law, Jennifer said. Marcus, you said you called the EPA. And the state environmental agency, the county water authority, and the Herald's environmental reporter. Good. But we need more. We need to prove a pattern of abuse and document everything he's done illegally. Jennifer was in full lawyer mode now. Tom, you mentioned research. What else did you find? Tom flipped through his notebook. Richard's been HOA president for 4 years. In that time, he's issued over 300 citations, collected nearly $50,000 in fines, and authorized 27 improvement projects without proper documentation. Jesus, Marcus breathed. It gets worse. Last year, he had Mrs. Patterson's rose garden removed because it was inconsistent with landscaping standards. The week after, his landscaping company got a contract to redesign the common areas. Sarah's eyes widened. Blackwood Landscaping. That's his company. His wife's company. Technically. That's a conflict of interest, Jennifer said immediately. Probably illegal depending on the HOA structure. Marcus felt a spark of hope growing into a flame. What else? The pool project 2 years ago. He claimed it needed emergency repairs. Bypassed the bidding process and awarded a $100,000 contract to his brother-in-law's construction company. I remember that, Sarah said. He said we had to act fast or the pool would be condemned. But I never saw any inspection reports. Because there weren't any, Tom said grimly. I checked with the county. No inspection requests, no condemnation. Notices, no emergency permits. Jennifer was furiously taking notes. This is looking like a pattern of fraud and embezzlement. Marcus, your creek might be the smallest part of this. But it's the most visible, Marcus realized. And it's happening right now. Exactly. Jennifer looked up from her notes. We need to move fast. Tom, can you document everything you found? Sarah, I need you to go through the HOA records and find every discrepancy. Marcus, keep recording everything that happens with the creek. What about the other neighbors? Sarah asked. A lot of people have been afraid to speak up because they don't want to be targeted. Fear is how men like Richard maintain power, Tom said. But once people see others standing up, they find their courage. Marcus looked around the table at these 3 people who'd barely known each other an hour ago but were now united in purpose. So what's our next move? We are going to do what Richard fears most, Jennifer said with a predatory smile. We are going to bring this into the light. 3 hours later, Marcus stood in his backyard with a borrowed megaphone and a crowd of 15 neighbors who'd gathered after Sarah's door-to-door campaign. The construction crew had taken a lunch break, leaving the half-destroyed creek bed looking like a war zone. Most of you have lived here longer than I have, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly across the yards. You remember when Willow Creek was the reason this neighborhood got its name. You remember your kids playing in that water, catching minnows, building fairy houses on the banks. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. This morning, Richard Blackwood destroyed that creek without a proper vote, without environmental permits, and without any consideration for what this community actually wants. But that's not the worst part. Marcus gestured toward Richard's property, where the new fountain system was clearly visible. The worst part is that he stole our creek for his own private water feature. He literally diverted a natural waterway to his backyard. The murmurs turned to angry voices. But it's not just about the creek, Sarah stepped forward. Tom Rodriguez has been investigating Richard's activities as HOA president, and what is found is shocking. Tom took the megaphone with the confidence of someone who'd addressed many crowds in his police career. In 4 years, Richard Blackwood has embezzled or misappropriated over $200,000 of your HOA fees. He's given contracts to his relatives, bypassed proper procedures, and issued fraudulent citations to intimidate anyone who questioned him. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. "What do we do about it?" called out Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman whose roses had been destroyed. "We fight back," Jennifer said, taking the megaphone. "We document everything, we file complaints with every relevant agency, and we demand a special election to remove him from office." "He'll retaliate," said David Kim from Oak Street. "He always does." "Let him try," Marcus said, his voice carrying without the megaphone. "He can't fine all of us. He can't intimidate all of us. And he sure as hell can't steal from all of us without consequences." The crowd began to cheer, but their celebration was cut short by the sound of a car door slamming. Richard Blackwood strode across the common area toward them, his face red with rage. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "It's called democracy," Marcus replied calmly. "Something you might want to look up. You're trespassing on HOA common property. I'm calling the police." "Please do," Tom said, stepping forward. "I'm Detective Rodriguez, retired. I'd love to explain to my former colleagues about your little embezzlement scheme." Richard's face went pale. "You can't prove anything." "Actually, I can." Tom pulled out his phone and showed Richard a photo. "This is a bank statement showing that Blackwood Landscaping has received $67,000 in HOA payments over the past 2 years. Payments that were never approved by the board and never put out for competitive bidding. That's standard maintenance. Standard maintenance doesn't include a $30,000 water feature that happens to be identical to the one in your backyard." The crowd pressed closer, and Marcus could see panic beginning to creep into Richard's eyes. "You people don't understand how things work," Richard said, his voice rising. "This community was falling apart before I took over. Property values were stagnant, the common areas were neglected, and nobody gave a damn about standards. So you decided to steal from us." Mrs. Patterson's voice was sharp with anger. "You destroyed my roses and then used my own HOA fees to pay for it. I improved this neighborhood," Richard shouted. "I brought order. I brought standards. I brought value. You brought tyranny," Marcus said quietly. "And it ends now." Richard looked around at the faces surrounding him, neighbors who'd been afraid of him for years, now united in their anger. For the first time since Marcus had known him, Richard Blackwood looked genuinely afraid. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Richard said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I have connections. I have resources. I can make your lives very difficult." "Bring it on," Marcus replied. Richard turned and stalked back toward his house, but stopped at the edge of the crowd. "You think you've won something here? This is just the beginning. I'll bury every single one of you." As Richard disappeared into his house, the crowd began to disperse, but Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Richard had been holding his phone the entire time, and the red recording light had been on. "Tom," Marcus said quietly. "He was recording us." Tom followed Marcus's gaze toward Richard's house, where they could see him in his kitchen window, already on his phone. "He's planning something," Tom said grimly. "What could he do?" "We." To the control panel, his heart pounding, and saw that the motion sensors in his backyard had been triggered. Through the kitchen window, he could see flashlight beams moving around his property. "What the hell?" he muttered, grabbing his phone and calling 911. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's prowling around my backyard. I can see flashlights. Officers are en route. Stay inside and away from windows. Marcus crept to his living room window and peered through the blinds. 3 figures in dark clothing were systematically searching his yard with flashlights. One of them was digging through his garbage cans, another was examining his fence line. And the third was taking photos of his house. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, "Are you seeing this? They are at my house too." Then another text from Jennifer, "Someone's going through my car. Police coming." Marcus's blood ran cold. This wasn't random. This was coordinated. The police arrived within minutes, but by then the intruders had vanished. Officer Patricia Valdez, a young patrol officer who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, took Marcus's statement with obvious skepticism. "You said there were 3 people searching your yard?" "Yes. With flashlights. They were going through my garbage." "Any idea what they might have been looking for?" "I think it has to do with the HOA situation. We confronted the president yesterday." "About, sir, I need to stick to the facts of the break-in. Did you see the suspects' faces?" Marcus bit back his frustration. "No, but any property damage or theft?" "Not that I can see, but I'll file a report. Probably kids looking for trouble." After the officer left, Marcus's phone rang. It was Tom. "Same thing happened to me," Tom said without preamble. "And Sarah and Jennifer. Someone searched all our properties around the same time. The police think it's random." "It's not random. It's intimidation. Richard's trying to find leverage on us." "What kind of leverage?" "Anything. Tax documents, personal information. Embarrassing photos. Men like Richard collect dirt on people as insurance." Marcus felt a chill. "What if they found something? Then we deal with it." "But Marcus, this escalation means we're winning. Desperate people do desperate things." The next morning, Marcus found out exactly how desperate Richard had become. His doorbell rang at 7 a.m., and he opened it to find 2 men in expensive suits standing on his porch. "Mr. Chen. I'm attorney Michael Hastings from Hastings, Burke and Associates. My client, Richard Blackwood, is prepared to offer you a settlement." Marcus blinked in surprise. "A settlement for what?" "For the defamatory statements you made yesterday regarding Mr. Blackwood's conduct as HOA president. Statements that were recorded and witnessed by multiple parties." "You mean the truth?" The second man stepped forward. "I'm David Burke, Mr. Hastings' partner. Mr. Chen, you accused our client of embezzlement and fraud in front of 15 witnesses. That's textbook defamation. It's textbook truth. Can you prove it in court?" Hastings asked smoothly. "Because we are prepared to file a lawsuit seeking damages of $200,000. Unless, of course, you are willing to issue a public apology and cease your harassment of Mr. Blackwood." Marcus stared at them. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. You have 24 hours to decide." Burke handed him a thick envelope. "This contains the complaint we'll file if you don't accept our settlement terms." After they left, Marcus called Jennifer immediately. "They can't be serious," she said after he explained the situation. "Defamation requires proving the statements were false. If we have evidence that he actually embezzled, do we have enough evidence to win in court?" There was a pause. "We have strong circumstantial evidence. But proving embezzlement definitively would require access to bank records, contracts, and HOA financial documents that we don't have. So they might win. They might tie us up in litigation for years. And legal fees could bankrupt most people." Marcus hung up feeling sick. 20 minutes later, his phone rang again. It was Sarah. "Marcus, I just got served with the same lawsuit. So did Tom and Jennifer. Jesus. He's suing all of us. It gets worse. I just got a call from my employer. Someone sent them photos of me drinking at the neighborhood barbecue last month, along with a letter claiming I have a drinking problem and shouldn't be working with children." Sarah worked as a kindergarten teacher. An accusation like that could destroy her career. That's insane. You had 2 beers at a cookout. The photos are taken from an angle that makes it look like I'm stumbling drunk. They are professionally shot, Marcus. Someone was watching us. Marcus felt his stomach turn. What did your principal say? She's required to investigate any allegations about staff. I'm on administrative leave pending a review. This is exactly what Richard wanted. He's trying to destroy our lives. Tom got hit too. Someone reported his security system to the city, claiming it violated privacy laws because it can see into neighbors' yards. And Jennifer's law firm received a complaint about her unethical solicitation of clients in the neighborhood. Marcus sank into his kitchen chair. He's systematically attacking everyone who stood up to him. And it's working. Half the people from yesterday's meeting have already called me to say they are backing out. They are scared. I don't blame them. Marcus, I need to ask you something. Is it worth it? Is the creek worth losing our jobs, our savings, our reputations? Marcus looked out his window at the destroyed creek bed. The construction crew was back, installing the decorative stone channels that would permanently erase any trace of the natural waterway. I don't know, he said honestly. That afternoon, Marcus sat in his living room staring at the settlement papers. All he had to do was sign them, issue a public apology, and agree never to question Richard's leadership again. In exchange, the lawsuit would disappear, and presumably, the attacks on his friends would stop. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your daughter goes to Valley Elementary, right? Nice school. Be a shame if something happened to disrupt her education. Marcus's hands shook as he read the message. Emma was only 7 years old. She had nothing to do with this. He was reaching for his phone to call Richard and accept the settlement when his doorbell rang. He opened it to find Mrs. Patterson standing there with a plate of cookies and a determined expression. I brought you some snickerdoodles, she said, pushing past him into his house. And I brought you something else. She set the cookies on his coffee table and pulled out a manila folder. What's this? It's Richard's real estate records for the past 5 years. My grandson works at the county clerk's office. Marcus opened the folder and found himself looking at property transfers, mortgage documents, and tax assessments. I don't understand. What am I looking at? Mrs. Patterson sat down heavily in his armchair. 3 years ago, Richard was about to lose his house. He'd overleveraged on some business investments and was facing foreclosure. Then suddenly, he paid off his entire mortgage in cash. $400,000. Where did he get that kind of money? That's what I wondered. So I had my grandson dig deeper. Look at the next page. Marcus flipped the page and found bank statements showing large cash deposits into Richard's personal account, deposits that corresponded exactly with HOA expenditures on common area improvements. He wasn't just skimming money, Marcus realized. He was stealing massive amounts. Over $800,000 in the past 3 years. He used our HOA fees to save his house and fund his lifestyle. Marcus stared at the documents. Mrs. Patterson, why are you showing me this? You could get in trouble. The elderly woman's eyes flashed with anger. Because 40 years ago, my husband and I bought our house specifically because of that creek. We used to sit on the back porch every evening and listen to the water. After he died, it was one of the few things that gave me comfort. She leaned forward. Richard Blackwood stole that from me. He stole it from all of us. And then he had the audacity to destroy my roses and make me pay for it. But the lawsuits, the retaliation, Marcus, I'm 78 years old. I've survived the death of my husband, cancer, and raising 4 children. I'm not about to let some petty tyrant intimidate me. Marcus looked at the documents again. This is enough to prove embezzlement. Real embezzlement, not just conflict of interest. It's enough to send him to prison. But we still have the defamation lawsuit to deal with. And is threatening my daughter. Mrs. Patterson smiled grimly. Oh, honey. Richard made a mistake threatening a child. That's when this stops being a civil matter and becomes a criminal one. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Detective Morrison. It's Helen Patterson. I need to report a case of criminal threatening and extortion. As Mrs. Patterson spoke to the police, Marcus realized that the war for Willowbrook had just shifted into a new phase. Richard had escalated from intimidation to direct threats, but in doing so, he'd made himself vulnerable to serious criminal charges. And more importantly, he'd underestimated the resolve of a neighborhood that had finally found its courage. Marcus picked up his phone and sent a group text to Tom, Sarah, and Jennifer, "Don't give up. We have him. Meet at my house tonight." Then he deleted the settlement papers without signing them. Richard Blackwood had made his choice. Now Marcus was making his. The gloves were coming off. The emergency neighborhood meeting that night drew 43 residents to Marcus's backyard, triple the number from the day before. Word had spread about the lawsuits, the intimidation tactics, and most importantly, Mrs. Patterson's bombshell. Financial evidence. Detective Morrison had arrived first, a stern-faced woman in her 50s who'd taken the criminal threatening report with professional seriousness. She'd confiscated Marcus's phone to preserve the threatening text messages and advised him to file for a restraining order. What Mr. Blackwood is doing constitutes criminal harassment, she'd explained to the crowd. Threatening a child crosses a line that makes this a felony. Now the neighborhood was buzzing with angry energy. Parents who'd been afraid to speak up were furious that children had been threatened. Retirees who'd lived in Willowbrook for decades were outraged by the financial theft. Even residents who'd previously supported Richard were beginning to question his methods. Jennifer stood at the front of the crowd with a stack of legal documents. "I've been in contact with the district attorney's office. With Mrs. Patterson's evidence, we have enough to file formal criminal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and extortion." "What about the defamation lawsuits?" asked David Kim. "Absolute defense. You can't successfully sue someone for defamation if the statements they made were true. And we can now prove everything we said about Richard was true." Sarah raised her hand. "What about the retaliation? My job is still in jeopardy. We file a harassment complaint and document everything. Richard's pattern of behavior shows clear intent to intimidate and silence opposition. That's witness tampering, which is another felony." Tom stepped forward, his detective training evident in his bearing. "I've been coordinating with Detective Morrison and the Financial Crimes Unit. They are executing a search warrant on Richard's house and office tomorrow morning." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. "But," Tom continued, "we need to be prepared for Richard's response. Cornered animals are dangerous and Richard has already shown he's willing to escalate." As if summoned by his words, the crowd's attention was drawn to movement across the common area. Richard Blackwood was walking toward them, flanked by 2 security guards and trailed by a man with a professional camera. "What's he doing?" someone whispered. "Creating a narrative," Jennifer said grimly. "He's going to claim we are an angry mob harassing him." Richard stopped about 20 feet from the crowd, well within earshot but maintaining what looked like a safe distance for the camera. The photographer began taking pictures immediately. "Neighbors," Richard called out, his voice carrying clearly. "I understand you're upset about the Creek project. I'm willing to discuss your concerns in a civilized manner." "Civilized?" Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the evening air like a blade. "You call threatening a 7-year-old child civilized? I have no idea what you're talking about." Marcus stepped forward, his phone in his hand. "I have the text messages, Richard. Detective Morrison has them too. Text messages can be faked. And I certainly wouldn't threaten anyone's child." Richard's tone was reasonable, almost hurt, clearly performed for the camera. "What about the $800,000 you stole from the HOA?" Tom called out. "Those are serious accusations with no basis in fact. I've served this community faithfully for 4 years." "Faithfully?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "You destroyed my career over a lie. Miss Martinez, your drinking problem is well documented. I simply brought it to your employer's attention out of concern for the children in your care." The crowd erupted in angry shouts, but Richard held up his hand with practiced calm. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. An angry mob making wild accusations. I've tried to work with you people, but you're clearly not interested in reasonable dialogue." Jennifer stepped forward. "Richard, you're being served with a restraining order. You're required to stay at least 500 feet away from Marcus Chen and his family. One of the security guards took the papers from Jennifer and handed them to Richard, who glanced at them with apparent surprise. "This is harassment," Richard said to the camera. "I'm the victim here." "You're the victim?" Marcus couldn't keep the incredulity out of his voice. "You destroyed a natural waterway for your own profit. I improved the drainage system to prevent flooding. Something you'd understand if you bothered to attend community meetings." "There was no vote," Sarah shouted. "I'm the secretary. I would know." "Miss Martinez, your drinking has clearly affected your memory." "Stop." The voice belonged to Frank Morrison, Detective Morrison's husband and a resident of Willowbrook for 15 years. He stepped out of the crowd with quiet authority. "Richard, I've known you for years. I've seen you at neighborhood events, watched you interact with families. I never would have believed you capable of this." Richard's carefully composed expression flickered for just a moment. "But threatening a child?" Frank shook his head. "That's not the man I thought I knew. Frank, you're being manipulated by—" "I saw the text messages, Richard. My wife showed them to me. And I've seen the financial records. You saved your own house with our money while destroying the things we loved about this neighborhood." More neighbors began stepping forward, each one sharing their own story of Richard's abuse of power. The photographer kept shooting, but Marcus realized the narrative was shifting. This didn't look like an angry mob anymore, it looked like a community confronting a corrupt leader. Richard's composure began to crack. "You people have no idea what I've done for this neighborhood. When I became president, property values were stagnant. The common areas were neglected. Nobody cared about maintaining standards. So you decided to steal from us," called out Janet Phillips from Cedar Lane. "I invested that money back into the community. The landscaping, the improvements, the maintenance, it all benefited everyone. Including the $400,000 fountain in your backyard." Mrs. Patterson's voice was sharp. Richard's face went red. "That fountain was paid for with my own money. Money you stole from us." Marcus stepped closer, his anger finally boiling over. "You took our creek, our money, our peace of mind, and you tried to destroy our lives when we stood up to you. You started this." Richard shouted, his careful facade finally cracking completely. "You and your pathetic obsession with that muddy ditch. You couldn't just accept progress. You had to stir up trouble." "Progress?" Marcus gestured at the destroyed creek bed. "You call theft and environmental destruction progress? I call it necessary. People like you don't understand what it takes to maintain a community. You don't understand the sacrifices I've made." "Sacrifices?" Sarah's voice was incredulous. "You mean the sacrifice of other people's money? I saved this neighborhood." Richard was screaming now, all pretense of calm gone. "I brought order. I brought standards. I brought value. And this is how you repay me." The photographer had stopped taking pictures, apparently recognizing that this outburst wasn't going to help Richard's case. "Richard," Jennifer said quietly, "you're in violation of the restraining order. You need to leave now." "I'm not going anywhere. This is my neighborhood. I built this community." "Sir," one of the security guards said nervously, "maybe we should." "Don't you dare." Richard spun on the guard. "I'm paying you to protect me from these people." "From what?" Marcus asked. "From the truth." Richard stared at him with pure hatred. "You have no idea what you've done. You think you've won something. You've destroyed everything I worked for." "You destroyed it yourself," Marcus replied. "The moment you decided the rules didn't apply to you." Richard looked around at the faces surrounding him, 43 neighbors who'd once been afraid of him, now united in their disgust. For the first time since Marcus had known him, Richard Blackwood looked broken. "Fine," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You want to know the truth? I did take the money. I did threaten your daughter. I did everything you accused me of and more." The crowd fell silent. But I did it for this neighborhood. I did it to maintain standards. I did it because someone had to make the hard decisions. You did it because you're a thief and a bully, Mrs. Patterson said quietly. Richard's laugh was bitter. You think you've won? You think this is over? I have backups of everything. Financial records, personal information, embarrassing photos. I know where all the bodies are buried in this neighborhood. Is that a threat? Detective Morrison had appeared at the edge of the crowd, apparently having been called by one of the neighbors. Richard looked at her, then at the crowd, then at Marcus. It's a promise. You people have no idea what I'm capable of. Actually, Detective Morrison said, stepping forward with handcuffs, I think we are about to find out. Richard Blackwood, you're under arrest for criminal threatening, extortion, and embezzlement. As the handcuffs clicked shut, Richard looked directly at Marcus. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Marcus replied. But as they led Richard away, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's final threat wasn't just bluster. The man had spent 4 years collecting secrets and building power. Even from jail, he might still have cards to play. The war for Willowbrook was nearing its end, but the most dangerous battle might still be ahead. 3 days after Richard's arrest, Marcus was awakened by pounding on his front door at 5 a.m. He stumbled downstairs to find Tom Rodriguez on his porch, holding a thick manila envelope and looking like he hadn't slept. We have a problem, Tom said without preamble. Richard made bail yesterday. His lawyer delivered this to every house in the neighborhood an hour ago. Marcus opened the envelope and found himself staring at a collection of photographs and documents that made his blood run cold. Pictures of neighbors in compromising situations, financial records showing tax discrepancies, copies of old police reports, medical records, and personal information that should never have been public. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed. How did he get all this? 4 years of systematic spying and investigation. He's been building blackmail files on everyone. Tom's voice was grim. Look at the letter. Marcus found a typed note on expensive letterhead, to the residents of Willowbrook. The enclosed materials represent just a small sample of the information I've collected during my tenure as your HOA president. Unless criminal charges against me are dropped and I am reinstated to my position within 48 hours, copies of these materials will be sent to employers, spouses, the IRS, immigration authorities, and local media as appropriate. Some of you have more to lose than others. Choose wisely. Blackwood is blackmailing the entire neighborhood, Marcus said. It gets worse. Look at what he has on you. Marcus flipped through the pages and found photos of himself and Jennifer Walsh having coffee at a local cafe, taken from angles that made their working relationship look intimate. There were screenshots of his browser history, copies of his tax returns, and even medical records from his daughter's pediatrician. This is insane. How is this legal? It's not. But the damage would be done before anyone could stop it. Your wife would see those photos before she learned the context. Marcus felt sick. Lisa was already stressed about his conflict with Richard. And photos like these could destroy his marriage even if they were completely innocent. His phone buzzed with a call from Sarah. Marcus, did you see? I saw. What did he get on you? Photos of me at my brother's bachelor party 3 years ago. I look drunk and I'm dancing with some guy. Out of context, it looks like I'm having an affair. Sarah's voice was strained. If my ex-husband sees these, he'll use them to challenge my custody arrangement. Marcus's phone was now buzzing constantly with calls and texts from panicked neighbors. Tom, what do we do? I don't know. Some of this stuff. It would destroy people's lives even if the charges against him stuck. Marcus stared at the photos in his hands. Richard had been planning this for years, collecting ammunition for exactly this scenario. Even from jail, he'd found a way to terrorize the entire neighborhood. There has to be something we can do. Like what? Even if we don't drop the charges, he can still release everything out of spite. We can't stop him. Marcus was about to respond when his doorbell rang again. He opened it to find Mrs. Patterson standing there with her own copy of the envelope, but unlike everyone else, she was smiling. "Helen, did you see what Richard I saw?" She walked into his kitchen and set the envelope on his counter. "I also saw something else. Something Richard didn't count on." She pulled out her phone and showed Marcus a text message, "Got your package." Interesting reading. But I think you'll find my counteroffer more compelling. Check your email. Detective Morrison, I don't understand. Mrs. Patterson's smile widened. Richard made one critical mistake. He included dirt on Detective Morrison's husband Frank in his little blackmail package. So Detective Morrison has been working this case from day one. She's had access to Richard's house, his computers, his files. She found everything. Mrs. Patterson pulled out another folder. Richard had blackmail material on half the city council, 3 judges, the police chief, and 2 county commissioners. He's been running a protection racket for years. Marcus stared at the documents. This is how Richard stayed in power for so long. This is how he got permits fast-tracked, violations overlooked, and investigations buried. He's been blackmailing city officials. Marcus's phone chimed with an email notification. The sender was Detective Morrison. "Mr. Chen, please forward this message to all Willowbrook residents. Richard Blackwood's blackmail attempt constitutes additional felony charges. More importantly, his files reveal a pattern of extortion targeting city officials that is now under federal investigation. Any materials he threatens to release will be evidence in a federal case, and their distribution will result in additional charges. Do not be intimidated. Justice is coming. Det Morrison. Federal investigation." Marcus looked up at Mrs. Patterson. "The FBI is taking over the case. Turns out Richard's been running a much bigger operation than we thought. The HOA theft was just the tip of the iceberg." As if on cue, Marcus heard the sound of helicopters overhead. Through his window, he could see law enforcement vehicles converging on Richard's house, FBI vans, state police cars, and federal agents in tactical gear. They are raiding him again. They are shutting down his entire operation. Richard thought he was untouchable because he had dirt on everyone. But he never counted on someone with nothing to lose standing up to him. Marcus looked at her questioningly. "You, dear. When you decided to fight for that creek, you started a chain reaction that brought down a criminal enterprise that had been operating for years." Marcus's phone was ringing constantly now, but the tone of the messages had changed. Instead of panic, neighbors were sharing Detective Morrison's email and expressing relief. The blackmail threat that had seemed so terrifying an hour ago was now evidence in a federal case. By noon, Richard Blackwood was back in custody, this time on federal charges. By evening, the local news was running stories about the Willowbrook conspiracy and the corrupt HOA president who tried to blackmail an entire community. But the real victory came a week later. Marcus stood in his backyard watching the restoration crew work to rebuild Willow Creek. The FBI had seized Richard's assets to pay restitution to the HOA, and the first priority had been restoring the natural waterway that had given the neighborhood its name. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, joining him at the fence. She'd been reinstated at her job after the FBI confirmed that Richard's accusations were part of his blackmail scheme. "It's better than beautiful," Marcus replied. "It's justice." The creek bed had been carefully reconstructed using Marcus's 20 years of documentation. Native plants were being restored and the natural flow patterns were being re-established. Where Richard's stolen fountain had stood, there was now just grass and a small plaque, "Willow Creek, restored 2025, in memory of community courage." "Tom says the FBI found evidence that Richard was taking bribes from developers too," Sarah said. "The whole creek destruction was probably about opening up the land for commercial development." Figures. It was never about drainage or beautification. Jennifer Walsh approached from across the yard, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the biggest smile Marcus had ever seen on her face. "I bring news from the courthouse," she announced. "Richard Blackwood just pled guilty to 14 federal charges. He's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison." The small crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers. "What about the HOA?" asked Tom. "The federal court has appointed an independent administrator to oversee new elections. The bylaws are being rewritten to prevent future abuse of power." Jennifer popped the champagne cork. "And all of Richard's fraudulent fines and citations have been voided." Mrs. Patterson raised her glass of champagne. "I'd like to propose a toast to Marcus Chen, who reminded us that sometimes one person standing up for what's right can change everything." "To the creek," Marcus corrected, raising his own glass. "And to the neighborhood that fought to save it." As the sun set over Willowbrook, Marcus listened to the gentle sound of water flowing through the rebuilt creek bed. His daughter Emma was catching fireflies with the other children, their laughter mixing with the babbling of the water. Sarah nudged him. "So what's next? Now that you've brought down a criminal conspiracy, regular HOA meetings are going to seem pretty boring." Marcus smiled. "I think boring sounds perfect." But as he watched his neighbors celebrating around the restored creek, Marcus realized that Richard had been wrong about one thing. This hadn't been about maintaining standards or bringing order to chaos. It had been about remembering that a community's strength comes not from the power of its leaders, but from the courage of its people to stand up for what they believe in. The war for Willowbrook was over. And the creek flowed on, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries to come. Some things, Marcus thought, are worth fighting for.